Go and the legal ramblings. What's been happening there? Give us a rundown of what's been happening with that.
Well, they haven't actually sued the main Linux distributions as such. And actually, Red Hat was a company that came back and sued them, that sued SCO. So what SCO is doing is playing a lot of legal tricks to draw out an unsubstantiated case, a case in which they actually have no evidence, as long as possible through the American legal system. And it's kind of a textbook example of here's how far you can get in court if you have absolutely no facts backing you up. And one of the things that companies learn to do very soon when communicating about Linux is do not lie to Linux users about the law, because Linux users and developers are scrupulous when it comes to copyright and attribution of software and documentation. They have to be, because all the code is out there for anyone to see. Any copyright infringement, plagiarism would be detectable very soon. And I've seen real copyright cases. What happens when a real copyright holder actually has a case? And they go through a series of steps that are absolutely nothing like what SCO is doing. SCO is kind of like one of those exploit programs that people post to bug track to prove that there's something wrong with a piece of software. SCO is an exploit that's being posted to prove that there's something wrong with the American legal system.
The aspect of plagiarism, you mentioned it just a second ago. Because code is all open, how, as a community, does Linux, the Linux community and the open source community, govern that and find people who are copying others' work?
Well, copying others' work is usually great. Under most circumstances with a piece of free software, you can take somebody else's work, modify and adapt it, and release a modified version. And that's excellent. That's the reason why we have free software licenses that allow copying, modifying, and redistribution. Copy is a good word. Copy is something that makes me very happy. And the important point about copying is to attribute what you copy correctly and to follow the license of the original software. And since people do so much work for you in writing useful software, making it possible and easy to copy, modify, and redistribute, then it's easy for you to do your share, which is to attribute their work properly and to follow their license.
How do you see Linux and open source software being beneficial to developing communities?
There are two software policies that a developing country can adopt. One is to lay down an open source software strong preference or mandate in law for government software purchases. And what that does is it creates a level playing field and a free market for software in that country. The other course of action that a country can adopt is to claim to treat free and proprietary software equally under the law. And as soon as a government decides to treat free and proprietary software equally, that creates a proprietary software mandate on the citizens. It creates an unaccountable tax on anyone who wants to do business with a government agency that's using proprietary software. Government says, we're willing to use either free or proprietary software. Proprietary software company in the USA says, Great. Government agency, here's this proprietary software at no charge. Government agency adopts the program, and then everyone who has to communicate and interact using that program's format has to go back to that software company in the USA and import more copies of that program. So the way for a developing country to keep a software market open and free within the country is to have a government mandate for either open source or for any software chosen for government use to include a right of reverse engineering, to include a right for that country's citizens to acquire any documentation needed to interoperate with that software. Now, in practice, most proprietary software companies would not allow you to reverse engineer, would not publish that kind of documentation. So you might as well simplify it and just make it an open source software only for government policy. That's the number one thing that developing countries can do. The other two important things that developing countries need to do is, one, not listen to U.S. trade representatives when they try to shove so-called anti-circumvention laws into treaties. And the U.S. trade representatives recently went to Australia, made Australia assent to a local law very much like the controversial DMCA in the United States. And what that does is it prohibits companies within that country from developing products that are interoperable with media products from abroad. So by choosing a DMCA-like law, which the U.S. trade representatives are fervently pushing everywhere around the world, you destroy a substantial part of your local ability to innovate and create new media products and devices. And finally, the third thing that you can do is some level of software patent reform, whether it is simply make software unpatentable, as poetry is unpatentable, or create a carved-out exemption for free software in patent licensing so that if you release something as free software, you're not at risk of a patent infringement lawsuit. And we do have a patent carve-out like that in the U.S. If there's a patented surgical technique and an individual surgeon uses that technique for a patient, that surgeon is not vulnerable to being sued. So some kind of a patent carve-out there is needed. And of course, no to DMCA-like anti-circumvention laws, and yes to a government open source purchasing policy.
The future of Linux, how do you see it in the next 2 to 3 years?
Linux is going to continue to take market share away from all the small players on the server side. So IT professionals, people who want to get qualified or certified to work with computers for their occupation, are going to have to be trained and certified with Linux. Really, a lot of the small Novell NetWare, AIX, HPX, SCO Unixware, of course, is on the way out. All those small-time OSs are going to have their market share taken away by Linux, and it's going to be down to Linux and Microsoft on the server side. So that's mainly important to people who want to choose IT as the field they want to work in. As far as end-user products goes, it's up in the air. It is going to be a fiercely competitive market. There's going to be more price cutting from the proprietary software vendors. There's going to be more feature adding from the Linux vendors. So we're going to have some interesting news stories on the desktop and the home front.
Don, I'd like to thank you for joining us here at Go Open, and thank you for taking some time out of your busy schedule.
Thank you.